Hi, this is Paul Robert Coyle, and I was a freelance writer for Star Trek Next Generation and Deep Space Nine and Voyager, and you're listening to Trek Untold.
Hello and welcome back to Trek Untold, the Star Trek podcast that goes beyond the stars. I'm your host, Matthew Kaplowitz. Have you ever wanted to write an episode of Star Trek? I think all of us out there have had ideas for something we want to see happen in a Star Trek show, and of course our imaginations went to town thinking about that. But most of us out there don't ever get the opportunity to make that a reality. On today's episode, we're speaking with Paul Robert Coyle, a television writer and producer who started out just like many of us, simply dreaming about making scripts, and eventually, he made those dreams come true. Paul was a huge Star Trek fan growing up and had the amazing opportunity to be taught by Dorothy Fontana. You'll hear the story today about a script he wrote for Star Trek the Animated Series back in the 70s, and why that episode ultimately never got made. We also talk about some of the work he did on The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, including the episode Whispers and the Voyager episode State of Flux. Paul also worked on shows like Jake and the Fat Man, Simon and Simon, Barnaby Jones, Chips, and many more, but chances are if you're around my age, you're going to likely know his work best from his time as a writer and producer on Hercules, The Legendary Journeys, and Xena, Warrior Princess. Paul recently published a book about his experiences in Hollywood from Jacobs Brown Press titled Swords, Starships, and Superheroes, From Star Trek to Xena to Hercules. So consider today a sneak peek at some of the stories you might read in that book. So get ready to learn about the process of writing shows for television, and especially for Star Trek, from Paul Robert Coyle. But before we jump into our interview, I want to ask you, are you following Trek Untold on social media? It's the best way to keep up to date on who's going to be the next guest on Trek Untold and to learn all about the other cool things that are happening here. So if you're on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter, go ahead and look up Trek Untold, all one word, and give us a follow and a like. If you'd like to help support the show monetarily, go ahead and check out teespring.com/stores/trekuntold to check out some of the merchandise we have available. This includes t-shirts, mugs, phone cases, sweatshirts, stickers, and a whole bunch more. So go ahead and check out teespring.com/stores/trekuntold. You can also support our show by visiting patreon.com/trekuntold. If you become a paid subscriber to Trek Untold, you'll get first access to the show and a chance to ask our guests questions on future episodes. But most of all, please subscribe to the show wherever you're listening to it or watching it. And if you've already done that, please also leave a review and a rating if you can. Leaving ratings and reviews helps increase the visibility of podcasts on platforms like iTunes and other places like it. It shows that you're listening, that you like it, and that other people who are interested in the same subject are going to probably like it too. It helps us grow, it helps us get better guests, and it helps us keep bringing this amazing Trek Untold show to you. If you're already following us or have supported us in any other way, thank you, of course, for being a part of the Trek Untold family. There's a lot of Star Trek podcasts out there, and we're very grateful that you chose us to listen to. I'd also like to make a quick shout out to our friends at Triple Fiction Productions, who make some great 3D printed Star Trek inspired toys and replicas for fans of all ages and toys of all sizes. But you'll hear more about them a little later on in the show. Now, without further ado, let's beam up this week's guest. Computer, access interview file. And welcome back to Trek Untold, and now joining us on the other side of the line, we've got Mr. Paul Robert Coyle. Paul, how are you this morning?
Hi, good to be here, Matthew.
Thanks so much for joining us. So we've got a lot to talk about today because I haven't had too many writers on the show who've actually written for TV, so I've got a lot of questions. I'm pretty excited to get your take on some things, and especially your take on all the different shows you've worked on, because you've got a pretty impressive resume.
Thank you. Yeah. And some Star Treks, and I have the new book in which I talk about yeah, a lot of cop and detective shows to begin with, and then gradually sci-fi and swords and sorcery. So yeah, largely freelance writing, and we'll talk about the days when Star Trek was wide open to freelance writers, and a lot of people got started there. I didn't exactly get started on Star Trek, but I made my contributions and had a lot of fun there, and was glad to do it. And got to worked with Mike Piller, who was already a friend from another show. Yeah.
So before we jump into things professionally, I'd like to ask you the first question I ask all of my guests, and what is your earliest memory of Star Trek from growing up?
I think I literally remember watching the premiere episode in September '66 at It was my first year of high school. I was just starting high school right around that same month. So for some reason in my mind, I connect those two. Plus, we had recently moved into the house that I was then living in. So the whole experience of watching it and being there at that time and place kind of stands out in my mind. So I watched it from the beginning, was a fan. And then as a few years went by, and then I became interested in writing, my own career as a writer. I zeroed in on television and I discovered some TV script. Well, I read a magazine, Writer's Digest, which had an excerpt, had an article about Star Trek. And they printed Harlan Ellison's teaser from his City on the Edge of Forever, maybe the first 5 or 6 pages. And that might have been the first time I ever seen a script. But yes, to answer your question, I watched the show from the beginning, became a fan, followed it from different time periods, was always aware from at least the second season on that the show was in trouble ratings wise. It struggled, it barely got a renewal for the third season, as I remember. So it's not a show that I specifically targeted when I started writing spec scripts on my own. I chose other scripts that I knew might still be around. But Star Trek is a big influence, not the biggest, but certainly one of the biggest. So I found myself, ironically, writing for the show in various versions as the years passed. So a Star Trek fan for sure, a man trap from the beginning. I didn't have many collectibles in those days. I wasn't aware of them, or we didn't have them where I was growing up in Providence, Rhode Island. I did have a giant balloon-like Enterprise that was hanging above my bed. A scale model, but pretty large. And I had that for years. I don't know whatever happened to it, but so yes, I was a fan. And the Man Trap, strange choice for premiere, right? I mean, it was the other 2 pilots that preceded it, both of which they ran off later in the year. Man Trap was not even an episode that centered on Kirk, the lead character. It was, not a stellar episode in and of itself, but nevertheless, it made an impression. So
I read your autobiography that just came out, Sword, Starships, and Superheroes, so I already know sort of the answer to this question I'm going to ask. But for folks who haven't read it yet, can you tell us where you grew up, what your parents did, and what little Paul wanted to be when he grew up?
Well, I grew up Providence, Rhode Island, born and raised. My father was a fireman. My mom a housewife. I had 2 younger sisters. So, and grew up going to Catholic school all my life. 8 years of grammar school and Blessed Sacrament School in Providence, and then on to LaSalle Academy. LaSalle was a Catholic high school, kind of a college prep school, which the kids who went there were the sons of politicians and so forth. I was, blue collar working class, and other kids wanted, were going to grow up to be accountants or doctors or lawyers or politicians or whatever. Nobody wanted to be a writer. Nobody wanted to be an actor. Nobody that I was exactly aware of was headed toward a career in entertainment. Although one of my classmates, wasn't close to him at the time, but his name was John O'Rourke. He became a very successful comedian. He came out to LA in 1980, joined the cast of Fridays, which is an ABC late night kind of a clone of Saturday Night Live. He's an impressionist, he's an actor, and he did a lot of work. So he and I both came out of that same class at LaSalle in Providence. And 2 other guys too migrated to Los Angeles over the years. But I was the first. As soon as I graduated high school, I hopped a bus and I came across country. By that time, I knew what I wanted to do. I had written short stories. I had written and submitted a story to Marvel Comics in New York based on Thor, the character Thor, right? I was interested in comic books. That was huge, not as an artist, but the stories. But I didn't know what a script of a comic book looked like. So I wrote a short story and I sent it, and I got a very nice letter from Stan Lee on Marvel Stationery, a rejection letter, and yet he was very enthusiastic about, stick at it. That was the end of my comic writing career, but he was really inspiring in terms of personally sending me a letter and signing it. And so at some point I turned my attention to writing scripts, and I just wrote them and sent them in across country to the a handful of shows that will be willing to read them. I think Star Trek might have might have been willing to read material if it was submitted by an agent or a lawyer, but I didn't have such people on my behalf. So I never targeted Star Trek for that reason, and also for the fact that I knew that it was always on the verge of cancellation. So why invest my time, you know? And the third reason I think I never would have attempted it was because of the technobabble, which to listen to it on television might be interesting, but I can't write that. I'm not a scientist, you know. To this day, if you're writing Star Trek, you've got tech consultants to help you or to revise that script. And during the days of Deep Space Nine and Voyager, it was still intimidating. But it was, you know, at least when you're on professional assignment, you have access to their tech people, and they'll rewrite you and make it what they want it to be anyway. But as a kid growing up, working on my own, writing specs, I did not attempt a Star Trek. As I say, I did other shows, the Western Death Valley Days, which is a long-running thing. Actually, I read an article where they were willing to read anything from anybody. So I wrote like 10 of those and got a really nice reaction, and I never sold one. But by the time I came to Hollywood, that show was canceled after 20 years. So it was starting fresh.
Just to backtrack for a second here, I do have to ask, as a comic book fan, from one comic reader to another, tell me you still have that letter from Stan Lee.
My mother threw it out along with my
Oh.
entire comic book collection when I moved away to college. All the early Marvel, Fantastic Four, #1, Spider-Man, I was right there at the beginning of the Marvel age. I was an avid collector. I kept all these things in pristine condition. They were treasures to me. And yet adults saw little value in them and thought that, you know, you're wasting your time instead of doing your homework. So the answer is no. And that Stan Lee letter, unfortunately, was in that box, which all went away. A year ago, I opened the paper and there's an ad for an auction that's coming up. And a specific comic book cover was listed for a starting bid of $200,000. That was in my collection. No, that's a sore point. No, so you'll have to take my word that I had that letter from Stan Lee. Unfortunately, I believe me, I would have printed it in the book if I still had it.
Well, it's a good memory to have at the very least.
Yeah.
So you mentioned at the start of this interview that you saw those original Star Trek scripts printed in a magazine. And was that your first time actually seeing a script ever?
As far as I remember, I think so, yes. And that was Harlan Ellison's draft. It was not the version that aired. Famously, you know, he was heavily rewritten. For some reason, he kept his name on it. On other shows, when he was rewritten, he would use a pseudonym, right? Cordwainer Bird was his preference. But he kept his name on that Star Trek and won an award for it. But the magazine published the teaser only. That's the post credits scene. So, but that was enough to you know. Prior to that, I guess I didn't know what a television script looked like. Maybe I assumed it was written in prose, like a short story. But this was broken down into shots and camera angles and dialogue, and that instantly appealed to me.
That leads me into my next question, because you got to spend some time with Dorothy Fontana, who is the famed TV writer and one of the women responsible for shaping Star Trek as a whole. So she was pretty important to your education and learning how to write, and also writing for TV in particular, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. She taught a class at Los Angeles City College, writing for television. Not writing for Star Trek, mind you, but writing for television, because I knew her name not only from Star Trek, but from Bonanza and Lancer and various other shows that she wrote during the time, usually using the name DC Fontana. Famously, she felt that producers might not be receptive to a woman, but they were fooled into thinking it was, you know, anyway, for whatever reason. I don't remember if I knew that she was a woman or not. I think I probably did. Not that it would have mattered, but I'm just saying a lot of people over the years that I've mentioned, I took Dorothy Fontana's class and they'd say, oh, DC Fontana, they assumed it was a guy for whatever reason, that most television writers in those days were. So I read as a high school kid looking, you know, to go to college. I went to the library because there's no internet. We're talking 1970 here, right? 1969, 1970. So I got a hold of school journal, you know, UCLA. I knew I had to, first of all, I already knew that to be a television writer in Hollywood, you had to be in Hollywood. I was aware of the concept of meetings, pitch meetings and so forth, and the writers don't get assignments unless they're physically present and able to go in and meet the producers. So I realized I have to move to Providence. And that's when I discovered that Dorothy Fontana was offering this class. at LACC. So that was it. It was a one night a week class, and I signed up for it, and that was great. So I I hopped on the Greyhound bus that summer. I did odd jobs and saved up my money and came to Los Angeles. It was a lot cheaper in those days to come to LA. The tuition was free, I think, right? As a city college. If there was anything that my parents paid, there may have been, but it wasn't a big, expensive private school. So I got to take advantage of this school, be in the television department, and then the Dorothy Fontana writing class, which was awesome. And I learned about things that I'd really never been aware of, like pitching a story. I didn't understand that you had to go in and pitch like an actor, put on a performance and sell a story to a producer before they would commit to your writing it. So that opened up that world. And Dorothy at the time was herself writing a lot of freelance scripts for shows of the period that you wouldn't remember, like Ghost Story and Assignment of Vienna, and Bonanza and so forth. So I was kind of living vicariously the experience of being a TV writer through the stories that she was telling every week. And she'd show us her various drafts. And we, the students, would pitch our own stories, and then develop our own stories. And in addition to that, she'd have guest speakers every week. And Gene Roddenberry came one week. And after the class, he took a bunch of us out to the House of Pancakes. And every week, the David W. Rintells came at one point. He later became president of the Writers Guild, but at the time I knew his name because he had written for The Invaders, another favorite show of mine. So every week, Dorothy's class was the highlight of my week, right? So all right, so that went on for 2 years. And then at some point, my memory is a little foggy of exactly how this happened. But the new Star Trek animated series on Saturday mornings was in development, was happening. And Dorothy was involved with it. And I landed an assignment, an official assignment. I guess I remember going to the Filmation offices on Sherman Way and Van Nuys. And what I'm not clear on is whether it began as a class assignment or class may have ended at that point and the summer hiatus was here. So I guess maybe for whatever reason, I was lucky enough to be chosen to pitch stories to that animated show. Nothing had been produced yet. I remember she showed me an animation cell. This is what it's going to look like. But I pitched a story about an alien bounty hunter that comes on board. It turns out there's a warrant out for one of the crew members, and that became the doctor. She said, "Oh, we're short on McCoy stories," so that developed into that. And that was a story called Albatross. I called it Albatross. I later changed the title to something else. So that was a paid assignment. I couldn't believe it. And I wrote an outline, and maybe I took notes and I rewrote the outline. So now understand that to this day in television, every assignment is a step assignment. A writer writes an outline or beat sheet and then gets paid for that. And then you wait for the pick up the script. And sometimes you get cut off. Sometimes another writer comes in and does the script at that point, or the original writer does it. And then you're paid separately for the script. And then you're paid separately for a revised version of the script. This was a half-hour cartoon shows, but those were still the rules. And it was not produced under Writers Guild jurisdiction either. And there was a Writers Guild strike going on at the time. So writers of primetime shows were free to do animation. So a lot of big name writers were coming, including several who had written for the show when it was on NBC. So I lucked out and I got an assignment, and I wrote the outline, and then I waited and waited. And class had ended at this point, so I was not seeing Dorothy every week anymore. And then the next thing that happened was, I went to a sci-fi convention at the Ambassador Hotel. It was a very early version of Comic-Con, not under that title, but a gathering of sci-fi fans. And the animated show had a panel. And I don't think that either Roddenberry or Dorothy were there, but whoever was on stage announced a list of names of writers that they'd hired and my name was announced. Nobody knew my name, but I couldn't believe it. I hadn't even expected that. So this was definitely official. Next thing, so time goes by and I'm waiting and I'm waiting. And if I placed any calls, I don't remember, they weren't returned because I was not in contact with anybody from Filmation. Dorothy was the only person I ever dealt with. Gene was kind of upstairs, and I never had a meeting with him. The only time I had met him was previously at that class when he came that night. But I got antsy and I said, oh, I can't wait to write this thing. So I wrote the script based on the outline that I had been paid for. And then I sent it in, and that was a big mistake. That's a professional no-no. And the next thing I know, I get a rejection letter, which I still have, and I print in the book, telling from Dorothy, explaining that Gene had changed his mind about doing the story and was shelving it, which happens. It had nothing to do with the quality of the writing, but they had decided against doing that story, and because they had not authorized me to write the script, they were refusing to pay for the script and considering a spec submission. So that was devastating to me at the time. Obviously, I told everybody I'm a big shot TV writer now, and so that turned out badly for me. And that was the end of the class, by the way. That was the end of the 2-year college. So I don't think she continued teaching after that anyway. So I never saw her after that or was in touch with her. And I never watched that animated show because that experience to me was so disappointing that I couldn't bring myself to watch that show. Apparently they produced, in the second season after Roddenberry and Dorothy had left, they did produce an episode called Albatross. I found this out years later. Same story. It had obviously been assigned to a different writer, a writer who had apparently no other TV credits. So I'm thinking it's somebody's pseudonym, I don't know whose. And although it was not my script, because they sent that script back to me, I don't believe any of them there even read it. You know, they weren't allowed. The lawyers wouldn't have allowed them to read it, so they sent it back to me. But a year later, when they were gone, the Filmation executives decided to do that story after all. My name was not credited, but I didn't even find out about that until years later. So all in all, that's quite a roller coaster of an experience for a 20-year-old kid, right? 21, whatever I was at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a heck of a lesson to learn at that age too, because I mean, you're basically at that point still breaking into the industry, and you're getting this big major gig, and you're rejected, and that's basically something that professional writers have to deal with a lot in their career. So I'm hoping you could tell us, how does a writer deal with and cope with and overcome rejection for trying to sell a script?
Yeah, or an actor going in and auditioning time after time and being rejected, right? I mean, you overcome it. Well, you either leave the business altogether, you give up, or you just persevere. I never doubted my talent. You know what I'm saying? Even though they rejected that script and apparently never read it, I thought it was a good script. I was proud of the job I had done in writing it. By the way, I don't have it anymore. I threw that out because, again, because of the whole experience. I didn't want to be reminded of it. Now I wish I'd saved it. But so I believed in my talent, and and the 2 years with Dorothy as a student were incredibly successful. Look, none of her other students in that class got an assignment on an actual show that paid real money, right? So at least I had that. Although it was not at this point a credit that I could claim because it was unproduced. So a few years went by, and I had odd jobs, and a night job as a security guard at a movie studio. And I continued writing spec scripts for various shows on television. And the long story short, I wrote a Streets of San Francisco that they bought and shot a week later. And I quit the guard job, and that began my career as a TV writer, and I never looked back. And I did eventually come back to the world of Star Trek, but in the meantime, I was writing shows like Streets of San Francisco and Barnaby Jones and Chips and shows of the period, detective and cop shows.
Now, before we move on to talk about some of your work in 90s Star Trek, I just want to ask one more question about Dorothy Fontana.
Sure.
Can you tell us, what is the most valuable lesson that you learned from your time being taught by her?
How to pitch stories is the one that comes to mind, because I didn't know anything about that. And I think a lot of people who are interested in a writing career don't understand that either, because you couldn't it's tough to read about that in the magazine. The magazines didn't even discuss it. They discussed about writing the script or what a script looks like or what the mechanics of what goes into writing a script. But to realize that you have to go in and verbally pitch. And I was shy, I wasn't used to getting up in front of a room of people and speaking like that. And a pitch can sometimes be to one producer or can sometimes be to a room full of 8 or 9 people. And you as a freelancer, you usually don't know when you walk in, who's going to be there. So you have to be prepared. And Dorothy's class taught me that. And I remember listening to some of the other kids pitching. And she herself would pitch, of course, give examples of how she might do it. And she was kind of soft-spoken too. Others, you have your own style as a pitcher. I tend to be kind of bombastic, and I might even get up and start walking around the room if I get excited about a story. But every writer has their own style. So the quick answer to your question is pitching was something that I totally learned about in Dorothy's class.
Trek Untold will return momentarily. Trek Untold is brought to you by Triple Fiction Productions. If you're a Star Trek cosplayer looking for props, or toy collector looking to spice up your shelves, Triple Fiction Productions has you covered. Triple Fiction Productions produces affordable and unique 3D printed Trek-inspired products from the original series, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Enterprise, and the movies. You can expect the same amount of care and attention to detail in any of the items in their catalog, whether it's a prop replica for use in a fan film, or a part of a cosplay, or accessories and playsets for figures from Playmates, Migos, or Diamond Select. Own your very own tricorder or phaser rifle with working lights, the bridge of the Enterprise E for your Playmates figures, or any other item from countless species and ships from the Star Trek universe. All products are 3D printed in the USA and are constantly evolving and improving based on fan feedback. To learn more about their products, visit them at triple-fictionproductions.net or on Facebook at facebook.com/triplefictionproductions. Triple Fiction Productions, taking Star Trek where no 3D printer has gone before.
This is Licia Naff, aka Ensign Sonia Gomez from Star Trek TNG, soon to get a promotion to captain on Lower Decks. Some of you may know me from my acting career, but a lot of you probably don't know me from my charity. It's called drivebydogooders.org. Myself and a bunch of teenage boys from the block, we all jump into my SUV every Sunday and we drive to the outskirts of town, and right from the car window, we deliver water and wipes and protein and tarps and socks to our adult homeless who truly need it right now. I don't know if you know this, but in LA, there's not one single public bathroom and not one single water fountain for anyone. And out there in Skid Row, there's 11,000 people in 20 square blocks. So our water and our wipes are really needed. We go out every week, and you can follow us on Instagram or Facebook or right on the website, drivebydogooders.org, and throw in any amount. Even a small amount is great. For instance, you can go on the website, and when you click on donate, you can see where $3 is going and what your money is going towards, or where $17 is going. Sometimes it's for cheese, sometimes it's for socks, sometimes it's for just what's really needed, which is water. Any holiday donations you might be deciding where to relegate, please consider drivebydogooders.org. It's also completely a tax write-off, and every little tiny bit helps, anywhere from $3 to $3 million. Your money goes directly to those who need it, and we have no overhead, no agenda, pure giving. And stay tuned for the animated version of Sonia Gomez on Lower Decks, coming soon. drivebydogooders.org. We drive by, and what do we do? We do good. Thanks so much. Hope to see you at my website. Bye.
We now return to Trek Untold.
So, Paul, let's talk a little bit about your time on Star Trek The Next Generation, where you contributed to 2 episodes that were produced. And I want to start first off with Yesterday's Enterprise. That's everybody's one of their favorites, really. I don't know anybody who doesn't like Yesterday's Enterprise. Can you tell us a bit about what you did? Well, first off, how you got connected back to Star Trek, and then what you did for that initial script.
Okay, well, in the case of Star Trek, backing up a few years, I had worked with Mike Pillar on Simon and Simon. Mike was story editor over there. After those years that I was talking about, where I was writing a lot of cop shows, Then I hit a dry period. In the early 80s, television kind of changed, and Hill Street Blues and comedy dramas came along, and ensemble shows, and the kind of old-fashioned show that I was writing fell out of favor, and so I had to reinvent myself. And I started writing specs again, and one of the specs I wrote was for Simon & Simon, a very popular comedy drama detective show on CBS. And basically Mike Pillar bought it. He was story editor, but he wasn't even producer, but he had me in. I mean, we kind of redeveloped it and we made some changes, and I wrote it as an assignment. But much of what I wrote in that spec script, which by the way, was about a comic book artist. And I incorporated into that script the fact that my mother had thrown out my comic book collection, except the two characters, Rick and AJ. I couldn't have their mother be the one who to have done it, because that's too horrendous and unforgivable a sin. So I had the older brother be the one who threw the younger brother's collection out, or vice versa, whatever it was. So I made a joke of it, but still, there's another traumatic incident in my life that I turned into something that became an episode of a show. So that was Mike Pillar, and then I did a second Simon & Simon, an assignment from scratch. And at that point, I then went on to staff at another CBS show, Crazy Like a Fox. So I might have worked more with Mike at that time. So Mike Pillar, after the Simon & Simon experience, I met with him again on another show or two that he was doing before Star Trek. I show us another sci-fi show called Hard Time on Planet Earth. I was about to do that one with him, but then they were canceled. So next thing I know, he goes on to Star Trek Next Gen, which surprised me because he never, we were friends and we'd have lunch and so forth. He never mentioned Star Trek or any particular interest in sci-fi, one way or the other. But he ended up on Star Trek, which had a reputation as a kind of a troubled show behind the scenes, with a lot of producer writers coming and going and them not being able to get a handle on it. The very early days of Next Gen. So Mike came in at some point early on in the third season. And before long, he called me in. He called me in to, you mentioned Yesterday's Enterprise. That's one. Well, Yesterday's Enterprise, he sent me the script. It was already written, and they had several drafts, a kind of a complicated time travel thing, right? And I contributed some ideas to that, but I don't remember that I actually did any writing on it. I think I was involved with other shows at the time, and I wasn't really free to do much. But then very quickly, he called me in for a different episode. It later became called Sarek. You're familiar with Sarek, the Vulcan, the father of Spock and so forth. But in its earlier form, it did not involve that character at all. Now, Mark Cushman, the writer who's written a lot of great Star Trek books, has talked about that he and his writing partner at the time had started that story when Gene Roddenberry was there, and that it had in fact centered on the character of Sarek. So they had done some work on it, but this was then, Mike was going to have me rewrite that. He was starting from scratch with that story. And one of the bigger rules at the time was to not reference the original Star Trek. They wanted to stand on their own and create new characters and new alien civilizations and new adventures. And they didn't want to revert back to the old. So he pitched it to me as an alien ambassador with an alien form of Alzheimer's, who was a hero of the cards or whatever. Now he's losing his stability. Not a Vulcan. And so I did a draft of that. Was it a story or a full script? That I don't quite remember. But I worked on that, was paid for that, and then went away. And then at some point after that, that's when they reverted back to its being the Sarek character. And then some other writer came in and then did a draft based on that character, and that's the episode that aired. So I believe I went through a Writers Guild arbitration, because every writer who works on a script contributes to a script in writing as part of the credits arbitration. The Writers Guild determines credits on these shows, not the producers. And believe me, every episode of Star Trek had the fingerprints of half a dozen different writers on it. It went through a lot of different typewriters, both freelance and staff. And ultimately, Mike Pillar would do a final draft, or Jerry Taylor on Voyager, or whoever. But and staff would rewrite other staff, and freelancers would sometimes, they had me in to rewrite other staff people. And typically, of course, staff would rewrite freelancers. But the point is, I did not get credit on Sarek, and I really hadn't done enough to deserve that anyway. Mark Cushman and his partner had the story credit, and so some other guy had teleplay. So that was Sarek, and that was Yesterday's Enterprise. And then at some point I did write a spec Star Trek Next Gen, and Mike read it and passed, but very soon after that they were developing Deep Space Nine, which I see behind your shoulder. And so I got called into that. So in the case of both Next Gen and DS9, I was lucky enough to be invited in and given work to do, as opposed to pitching my heart out. Later I pitched, but to start with, I had a running jump because of my prior relationship with Mike Piller. He was happy with the work I had done on Simon & Simon, and that's why he brought me to Star Trek. He didn't know anything about my animated Trek misadventure, you know. He didn't care about that anyway.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Deep Space Nine, so we could jump into a little bit about that, because you had your hands involved in the infamous season 1 episode that became Move Along Home. It's better left undiscussed in some ways, but I got to hear more about this because it's like one of my favorite bad episodes. I don't know. It's got an interesting reputation. I don't know if you're aware of that among the Trek community.
I think so. Yeah, I've heard things about it over the years.
I will say, just for my own defense, I actually think I like that episode. I don't think it's one of the worst things ever made, for sure. It gets a bad rep. I enjoyed it, but yeah, I'm curious to hear a little bit more about the behind the scenes of the creation of that episode.
Right. Well, at that time it was called Sore Losers, and the show was not on the air yet. Okay, and I don't think they had produced the pilot yet either. So this was in the very early stages. So they had not cast it, and I think the Kira character may not have been there. It was Ro, and I was originally going to be the Ro character from Next Gen. Anyway, the point is, Mike calls me in and explains this is what the show is going to be. We're not on a ship anymore. We're on a space station. And he had written Sore Losers, a detailed outline of what he wanted that to be. And wait a minute. So yes, somebody else had written a draft of that, a script draft of Mike's story, and Mike didn't like the job that writer had done. So he wanted me to rewrite that other writer. And specifically, he wanted to open the thing up. This was all about the aliens who forced Quark to play a game, and then the Cisco and company are zapped into the game, and the stakes are life and death, or so they think, and they're forced to play along and ingeniously find their way out of situations while trying to find their way home. It was an alien first contact situation which goes astray because all the aliens are interested in is gambling. All right, that was the premise. Certainly a workable premise and a fun idea. But he wanted to open the thing up. And he wanted to be a big outdoor show, like the Village from the Prisoner, the Patrick McGowan British show, you know, which shot at an actual location in Wales, I think. So he wanted my job was to open the thing up and make it less interior and to revoice the characters and bring them more in line with the voices that had been written in the pilot script. And again, I don't think I had heard them because the actors hadn't been cast yet. So that's what I did, and I rewrote that script and I opened it all up, and I got paid a very nice amount of money for that. And then I went away, and then the next thing, the studio people came in and they said, we can't afford to do all this exterior stuff. You know, we have to be 6 days on stage and at most one exterior, and the exterior might be the back lot. So they couldn't afford to go to a seaside location and have a big outdoor adventure. The realities of being a television show settled in. So the next team of writers that came in to do a draft pared it all down, and it became a very interior thing where they're trapped in a series of corridors, very suffocating. I thought that's part of the objection, I think, to seeing it on screen. And you're in a cave, you're in a cave and it's very dark and dank, and it just became a suffocating episode. And then Mike Piller came into the end and did the final draft himself. And then the credits arbitration, there were all of us different writers seeking credit on it. And I was the middle guy, so you know, it was almost impossible to think that the Guild would allow me credit. And they didn't. But that was fair enough. I'd been paid and I did work on it. And they didn't reject my contributions because of the quality of my work, but because he had asked me to do something that they couldn't ultimately afford to do. So that got that got turned down, and that became Move Along Home. And part of the bad rep that it has, I believe, is because of the fact that it looked cheap.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you're referencing The Prisoner, because that would have made the show just be completely different on so many levels. I'd love to hear a little bit more if you remember about what some of the plans were for the characters to have done in this basically completely different world as opposed to what happened in the corridors. Do you remember what you had all the people doing?
Well, whatever they were doing in terms of the specific games that they were playing, I think they all came from Mike's original story. Many of those probably survived into the final draft, where you're playing a game of hopscotch with a kid, right? And you have to mimic her movements or whatever. I don't remember specifically what I did in terms of, part of it might have involved the ocean, going into the ocean and swimming. Again, unless you're on location, they can't possibly do that. So all that got put aside. And I'm not saying that the script would have been terribly better had it been shot under those circumstances, but I do think it would have looked better. But the story would have been basically the same. I'm not defending it. I'm just saying that that's the circumstances under which I was hired to write it, to rewrite it. And but again, the work I did didn't work out, but there were no hard feelings on Mike's part, and the show was open to me to come in and pitch, and I did. And then I went on to do another episode, and then kind of another one after that too.
So I've got one thing I'm actually a little bit curious about Move Along Home, and because you kind of brought up the hopscotch scene, was the Alan Moraine Count to Four song always part of the episode?
Well, the idea of it was with that specific phrase. I don't remember what it was in the script. It doesn't sound like something I would have invented. So it was either there or what of the other many writers who worked on the episode contributed. But the idea of a game of hopscotch, yes, I think that originated in Mike's story.
And you also contributed to the episode Whispers, which is a O'Brien heavy episode. I think it's a really interesting episode. I always like watching that one. It's got, I think, a pretty good ending too. What can you tell us about working on Whispers?
All right. Well, that was his pitch from the start. All right. So after the Sore Losers Move Along Home incident with the show, by that point the show did come on the air, so I was able to watch it and get a sense of the characters' voices and so forth. So then I went in to pitch for the second season. And first, they were all very interested in a show I had called The Beacon, about an underground radio station on DS9 operated by a Bajoran cell who objected to the Federation's presence as much as they had to the Cardassians taking over the station. That got kicked around for a long time, and for whatever reason, finally did not get done. So I went in and I called for another pitch meeting. Star Trek is wide open to freelancers, by the way. I mean, those of us who had done that, I'd already written the one to this point, or writers with credits, either in sci-fi or not, or writers that Mike Pillar knew or Ira Bear knew, and so forth. So it was always an open door policy. They had an unlimited amount of money to hire writers and to purchase scripts, many of which they ate and threw away. No show today would do that, but Star Trek burned money as far as hiring writers and going through. Look how many writers worked on drafts of Sore Losers, right? They paid 1, 2, 3, and at least 4 different people to write complete drafts, and that, each draft was paid in full. All right, so I pitched The Beacon, and that struck out. Then so now I called for another meeting. We're going to have 6 more stories. Every time you go in, you're going to go in with half a dozen or so. And this time I met with Jim Crocker, who was another Simon & Simon guy who Mike had brought onto staff, and at that point was a supervised producer. And I pitched, however many stories I pitched, the one that he was really interested in was a Twilight Zone-esque story about O'Brien waking up on the station one morning and nobody remembers who he is. That was my original script. And then, so he liked that, and they were looking for mystery stories of that nature specifically. So that fit that. And then the next thing I know, I was called in. It was an official assignment, and I was called in to meet with Mike Pillar and Ira Bear and Pete Fields to develop that story further. And somehow in the meeting, at some point, the idea of the amnesia, they backed away from that. I think they felt that they had done a Next Gen episode where Crusher had remember me, right? She wakes up and she says various people in the crew aren't there anymore. And nobody remembers them. And one by one, they start disappearing. I don't remember if that as episode preceded mine or not, but maybe they felt that was too similar to that. So the idea of the nobody remembers who O'Brien is got dropped. But the idea of his waking up into a mystery, coming back to the station, and things are happening and the people are acting differently toward him, and he begins to sense, what's going on, there's some conspiracy. It quickly got turned into a paranoia story. An invasion of the body snatchers was quoted as the kind of tone that they were looking for in this episode. So that developed, and then I went. That was a pretty simple, straightforward. I wrote that story. We had a story break session, as happens, where you go in the room and on the board you work out the beats of the story. That takes a couple of days, and then I went off and I wrote the script, and that was pretty much the end of it. Maybe I did a rewrite, and Mike Pillar later came in. All right, the twist in that story was that O'Brien turns out to be a replicant. All right, it's the O'Brien that we've been seeing through the whole show and seeing the story through his eyes is not the real O'Brien at all, and that's what he thinks he is. He's an assassin who's been programmed to come and kill some alien at a peace conference or whatever. And everybody else is kind of suspicious of O'Brien, but he doesn't understand. He thinks that it's because something's going on with them in terms of a conspiracy. And then he escapes on the station and tries to go to where the peace conference is going to take place. So that was a different story in the sense that we could never cut away from O'Brien and go to other characters for any kind of a B story. If we did, they'd be saying, what's going on with O'Brien, right? So it was a very closed in on that one character, and he carried every scene. Cole Meany, I don't think had ever been so had to work so much on the show. He was on every day from start to finish. He was in every scene. So the script came up a little short because there was no B story to cut to. So Mike then at the end, Mike came in and inserted scenes. We opened the show with O'Brien on the runabout, already going away from DS9 and dictating a story to the computer. And then we flash back to see to my story, so to speak. So it came up 5 or 6 minutes short, and Mike added those scenes. So the shooting script is credited both Mike and myself, but the guild came in and I had full written by credit because the runabout scenes were added strictly to pad the story out. They were perfectly fine. I had no objection to them, but they didn't enhance the story really. So that was my written by credit, and I used the term replicant to describe the clone in the end, simply because I'd never heard that used in the Star Trek universe. Of course, it came from Blade Runner. Maybe Philip Dick took that from someplace else. I don't know. But the point is, I plugged in replicant. I kind of thought they would change it just back to clone, but they never did. So as far as I know, that's the only time the term was used in the Trek universe, certainly up to that point. And so that was my adventure with Whispers, and that turned out to be a very successful episode. And the ending seemed to work and to surprise a lot of people. And over the years, I've had a lot of compliments about that O. Henry twist, which was, again, part of my original story, even when it was an amnesia story.
Yeah, I really like it. I remember watching that one the first time and just like wondering where it's going to go, how it's going to end up, and being pretty happy with it. So yeah, I think it's a great one. And I think another one that's really worth mentioning too from your time on Voyager is the episode State of Flux, because you ultimately are the man responsible for the initial idea of Seska. And Seska is a character who would then affect many other seasons of Voyager. So can you tell us a little bit about State of Flux and the creation of this character?
Sure. All right. So after the Deep Space Nines, and I kind of did another one after that too, that there was a Kira story. She discovers a portal to the past, and she was back to Tarak Nor, which was the station under Cardassian rule. They loved that idea, and they wanted to do it. And a year and a half went by, and they finally called me to proceed. And I was on staff at another show, so I couldn't do it. But they did pay me for that story. So in that sense, I kind of had a third Deep Space Nine, again, uncredited. Ultimately, they changed the story a lot, but it still became Kira going to the past. So after having done all of those DS9s, then Voyager came along. And again, it was an early situation. They had not shot the pilot yet, or they were in the process of shooting it maybe, and they had cast Genevieve Bujold as Janeway. So Mike Pillar called me in again and gave me the pilot script. I think I contacted him before the pilot script was even written, because I had heard that the Voyager was a go for UPN, right? And he said, "Oh, we'll definitely have you in as soon as we're open, but I haven't written this pilot yet." So I had to wait a little while. And then sure enough, when the time came, he sent me the 2-hour pilot script. So I read it, and here are the characters. And now I go away and I come up with situations. Again, a half dozen stories or so. So the day comes and I come in for the pitch meeting, and it was Mike. It was just Mike. It was always the way I preferred it. One-on-one with the producer is always best, you know. Nowadays you go in and it's 8 people at the table, but then it was Mike. A friendly, receptive guy, and as I say, a friend. We had done the other shows together, and the first pitch out of my mouth was basically the Seska pitch. A member of the crew that Chakotay has taken on board turns out to be a spy, genetically, you know, a Cardassian, and she's disguised as a Bajoran or whatever. And he really liked that. And yet he was not by nature an enthusiastic person. He was very subtle and underplayed, and started running with the idea, yeah, that could work, blah, blah, blah. And then I wanted to get all of my stories out, because I had a half a dozen, and I thought they were all equally good. And the Seska story, frankly, wasn't even my strongest story, because my habit was not to pitch my best story first, because what if I'm nervous at the top of the meeting, or, you know, what if things go wrong, or other people are coming and going? Until I get settled in, I want to hold my best stories back for second or third. But he was really interested in that first one. And I continued to pitch a few more stubbornly. And he finally said, you know, shut me down. And I said, no, I want to do the first one. Let's just talk about that. That was an assignment in the room. He sent me out of there to go home and write an outline, and then call the secretary to strike a deal memo with my agent. That almost never happens in television. Even if a producer really wants to do a story, they have to check with an executive producer or get a go-ahead from the studio, and that usually takes 24 hours. But I walked out of that meeting. Ira Bear was in the hall, and he had heard about it and congratulated me, and I was the first freelancer to sell a story pitch to Voyager, I later found out. All right, so that story about her name wasn't Seska at the time. It was a different name, but it was still basically that same character, a Cardassian disguised as a Bajoran or whatever she was, always a woman. So that story went through. Oh, so I did a script. I mean, I did a story of that, and then a rewrite, I guess. And then Jerry Taylor called one day to say, "Oh, thanks, Paul. Good work, and we'll be taking it from here." So I was being cut off, as many freelancers in the world of Star Trek were. The story, for whatever reason, wasn't hitting on all cylinders, so they were bringing another writer in to write the script. And ultimately, yes, I got full story by credit on that, and I did create the character of Seska. However, what happened was, it was a guest star role, obviously, for this one episode. And they felt it was too important a character to come out of nowhere to be on the Chakotay's Maquis crew. So they backed up, and they put her into a few early episodes prior to mine, so that she wouldn't appear out of nowhere. So Martha Hackett, the actress that they cast, who was wonderful, appeared as Seska a few times prior to mine. For that reason, I did not get the character creation payments that normally would come with a recurring character. And well, that happens. But and she became, as you know, she appeared 12 times or so over the course, and slowly reverting back to her Cardassian appearance. I thought that was really interesting. I did have trouble at the beginning saying, well, we're stuck in the quadrant. What is it? The Delta Quadrant or the Alpha Quadrant or wherever the hell we were, and we're trying to get home, and we're speeding at light warp speed. How can we keep encountering the same? How can Seska be still showing up every 6 weeks? You know, that's the way they chose to do the show. So you can't. You just have to go with it. Seska kept reappearing because apparently she and the Kala, what was he? The Kazon, originally Kazon with a G. They were chasing after Voyager and staying on their tail apparently for quite a few seasons. But a very successful character, terrific actress. Casting, of course, always brings so much to these recurring villain types. So I was very happy that they had found success at Seska. And at that point, I started being involved with other shows like Xena and Hercules, so I got pulled away from the world of Star Trek. I did later go back and pitch Voyager a few times, with the point where Mike Piller had stepped off the show and other people were now in charge. And I kept meeting with people I didn't know, and they didn't know my work really. And at one point, I pitched another Seska story, and they shot it down saying, "We want to hear original characters from you." And here I was, I created Seska, but I kept my mouth shut. And so I never reconnected with Voyager. So I just did that one episode, but it turned out well, and the character itself was highly successful. Again, a Star Trek credit that I could call my own, and then I moved on to other shows. Yeah.
Now, throughout all these different iterations of Star Trek that you wrote for, were there rules or guidelines, or basically what kind of information did you get from the studio to know that you could or couldn't do when you wrote your spec scripts?
Well, not from the studio, but from the Star Trek people themselves. Of course, every Star Trek show had a Bible, so to speak. They had their pilot written. They were all 2 hours in the case of Next Gen, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager. And then they would have a writer's guide that they would update every season. These are the kind of stories we're looking for. Or this, all right, we've done too many Kira stories at this point, so we'd like to look for Bashir stories or whatever. And specific types of stories, like the mystery stories that they were looking for at the time I pitched Whispers, that came directly out of their pitch sheet, giving tips on what kind of stories they were interested in hearing. And they would update these every season for each show. And I do print some excerpts from them in my book, because I was always fascinated in reading that kind of thing from Star Trek, or any show really. But Star Trek, they overdid it. They did it every season, and could be quite lengthy. And in addition to that, the log lines of episodes that they've previously done helps you, because you need to know what they've done so you can avoid that and not do anything too similar. So the answer is that those were the guidelines you would get. More specifically, if preceding a meeting, they might tell you on the phone, "Oh, don't pitch any Odo stories, because we're full up on Odo stories." General specifics like that. And then you go in and you do the best you can. You start to pitch a story, and they say, "Oh, we're doing one like that right now anyway." So that's always going to happen, no matter what the circumstances. And in the case of Trek, I put so much pressure on myself, because they had done so many dozens, maybe hundreds of episodes prior to that, between the various Treks that had already been on the air. So coming up with fresh story ideas, it was always a challenge to me. And they're still going, they're still doing them. So the ideas are coming from somewhere, I don't know where, but somehow there are still fresh stories to tell in the world of Star Trek.
In your book, you also talk a lot about Alex Kurtzman, who we know now is the man running the current series of Treks.
Right.
What was your relationship with Alex?
Well, Alex and I were both on staff at Hercules and Xena. When I came to Hercules, well, first I wrote for Xena, all right? And Sam Raimi and Rob Tappert were the executive producers, and I had turned the show down in its first season because I didn't know what it was, and it sounded dopey to me. Xena Warrior Princess, all right? So I went in, and Alex was, I would call him the equivalent of Brandon Braga in those days. The young, I don't think he was an intern, but he was an assistant of some sort. He would sit in the corner, dressed all in black, and furiously scribble notes on a pad, keep to himself, except when he would be asked to contribute ideas, he would be very forthcoming, a very bright, young, quiet guy. At the time at Renaissance, he was in that capacity. And then he became a writer and brought in his friend Bob Orsi, and they became a writing team. And about the same time I went on to Hercules as the co-producer level, they came on as staff writers. So we spent 2 years together on Hercules. And then Alex and Bob also moved on to Xena at some point. Well, I first wrote a bunch of Xenas freelance, and then I went on to staff at Hercules. And Alex was there the whole time. So we were very close during that period. And then, of course, he and Bob went on to write every movie in the world, every big budget Mission Impossible, the Star Trek features, Transformers, and so forth. They became huge in the world of tentpole features, big studio productions. But they got their start, at Hercules and Xena. Alex, a very bright guy, and I interview him for my book, and I have tips from him for people who might have their eye on writing for Star Trek today. It's a very different situation than it ever was during the times I was doing it. They are not open to freelance pitches. That's never going to happen again. And the lawyers will not let them read spec submissions the way Mike Pillar always did, and Gene Roddenberry did before him. Unfortunately, that era of Star Trek freelance access is gone. But of course, the shows go on, and the writers somehow find their way to do them. So it's a different scenario these days. But Star Trek continues. But my experiences of freelance writing are, I tell my stories, and that's the way it happened to me, and it's going to happen differently to writers today.
Yeah, I really enjoyed in your book reading about all the behind the scenes stories you've got for Hercules and Xena. And, we could easily spend a whole other episode just about that, but we only have so much time today. I did want to ask you about one particular thing that I always liked in Hercules, and that was the mirror universe. And you created the Sovereign and just basically all the mirror counterparts. It was very much like the mirror universe in Star Trek. Was that where that kind of came from?
Absolutely. That was Rob Tapert, our executive producer's idea. He wanted to do an alternate. When I came onto Hercules and Xena, I kind of brought sci-fi ideas because I was moving directly from the Star Treks that I had been doing. All right. And prior to that, the shows had been on the air for a few years and had already burned through all the Greek myths. So they were looking to expand. And I was thinking a little bit outside that box. And so they turned to me for time travel stories and alternate universe stories. And Rob specifically wanted to do an alternate universe. And yes, he cited that original mirror universe from Star Trek, which DS9 itself had then gone on to do, right? A world where our characters would play dual roles. We'd get to meet Herc's evil twin, and there'd be twin characters for the various characters. I'm the one who kind of skewed that toward comedy. That wasn't necessarily that's not what Star Trek did. And I think Rob originally wanted to do a serious world. And I just went with the fun of it. I went in a different direction. And and Lucy came over and did a guest shot as her Xena's twin. And so that turned out to be a popular episode in itself. Yeah, but definitely somewhat inspired by the Trek mirror universe stories.
And we have to add that technically speaking, Paul Robert Coyle does appear in Hercules. In the episode Yes, Virginia, there is a Hercules, which I love too. It's like one of the earliest times I think I remember seeing anything meta on a TV show. I love
Again, that was written. Yeah, well, that was written by Alex and Bob. That we did two of those. With that episode, it was so successful. We did a sequel a year later where the actors on the show played us, the writers and producers on the show. How did that happen? Well, we did a clip show. Kevin Sorbo had a big medical crisis that year and had to miss a whole lot of episodes. He was hospitalized, and so we had to carry on the season without doing a show called Hercules without our star playing Hercules. So we do a clip show, so we'll be able to do clips that Kevin's in. But it's us. It's Alex and Bob pitched this. It's us sitting around the table, just like we were doing in real life, pitching how to keep the show alive without Kevin Sorbo. And one of us will say, "Oh, we'll do an animated version," and one of us will say, "We'll do Bruce Campbell as Autolycus will be the lead." And they pitched all of the castings. Bruce Campbell, who had a recurring role on the show, was an old friend of Rob Tapert and Sam Raimi's. He would play Rob. And then they come to me and they say, Michael Hurst, who played Aeolus, Herc's buddy, a very popular recurring character, Herc will play Paul. And Paul will be, and they knew that I went to Vegas, right? So that was true. So Paul will be a inveterate gambler and a drunk and a lech, and he's always lusting after Rob Tapert's secretary. And this, I remember sitting around, we're all amused by this because it's about us, but I'm thinking, well, the studio's never going to allow this. This is a great in-joke to those of us who are on the show, but the audience isn't going to understand who we are. but that got done, and in fact, it proved very popular, right? And then a year later, we did a sequel. So I became a character on the show, and when I would show up to speak at conventions, because at that time, believe me, Herc and Xena conventions were as popular as Star Trek conventions for a while, but put on by the same people, Creation, right? So I would show up to speak to the fans, and they knew me as a writer, and they also knew me as a character played by Michael Hurst. So I wasn't in reality that character. They understood that, but that was quite a different thing to be. Star Trek. Now, when they did that episode with Cisco, right, as a novelist or something, but that was not. Yeah, that was not a comedy, and that's not the way we did it. He was not playing Gene Roddenberry, right? He was playing a fictional author. Yeah. All right. So there's no really comparison to that. But in our case, yes, I became a character on the show as well as a writer producer on the show. So the fans knew me as both.
So I got to say, also, just from reading your book, I really like that you included, as you mentioned throughout this interview, you've included detailed script outlines and also just large chunks of scripts as well. Because really, like you said at the start of this interview, back when you were first learning how to do this, things weren't really as accessible. Today we have the internet, so there's a lot more resources at our hands. But it's one thing to have the resources available. It's another to have somebody like yourself talking us through the process and then showing the resources. So I just really want to give you a big thanks for doing that and including your expertise in the book.
Yeah, I wanted to include a lot more excerpts, but the lawyers of the publishers' lawyers are always afraid of being sued,
I'm sure.
So they can print excerpts, but not entire documents. But I was so influenced by Harlan Ellison's pages of that original script of his that were published when I was a kid, and I wanted to make sure there's material of that nature in the book, not just scripts, but beat sheets and outlines. So a writer interested in knowing what that's all about will have samples to see from both Star Trek and some of the other shows.
It's all really excellent, valuable information just to have at your fingertips. So on that topic there, I'd like to ask you, from both a, I guess, creative and a professional standpoint, what makes a script for a TV show not just good, but also sellable? Because I think that's kind of the key word here is sellability.
Yeah, well, you sell it in terms of the pitch, right? So it's going to be a verbal pitch. Well, I mean, to back up, yes, I sold that first Streets of San Francisco. That was something that I wrote, and they read and they liked and they bought. That happens more in the world of movies than in television, but it has occasionally happened in television. It's not likely to happen today because, as I mentioned, the lawyers of a given show will not allow the producers of that show to read specs for their own show. People will still write a spec as a sample, but it's going to be a sample for some other show rather than the one they wrote it for. It's a terrible situation. I don't agree with it, but it's the way it is. So what makes a script successful? If it's a spec script, it has to be well written. That's pretty much, that's not easy to do, but it's easy to say, right? And it has to catch the voices of the continuing characters in that show and tell an interesting story. In terms of a verbal pitch, it has to excite the producers. Now, every writer has their own style. They're not always going to be bombastic. Some of them are going to be, as I mentioned, I thought Dorothy Fontana was a low-key kind of person. So in terms of her pitch, she was not going to be overly excitable, but some writers will be, and some producers will be, they'll listen, or they'll interrupt, or they'll cut you off, or they'll interject their own ideas. That's kind of important. You want to get it interactive and get them involved and in the process. When Mike Pillar reacted to that Seska story, he's immediately started improvising scenarios that she can be involved with. So, what makes a successful pitch is one that there is perk up or whatever. Oh, we haven't done that story before. Or yes, I see the possibilities that we could do that story. Or yes, the character of Seska might even be a continuing character. It could work beyond this one episode. That, believe me, I would have sold a lot more pitches if I had the perfect answer to that question. What makes a successful pitch? What makes a successful actor's audition? I mean, they're lucky if they get 1 out of 10, right? So the answer is you keep trying, and you make it fun for yourself to the extent that you can. There's always pressure when you go into these kind of meetings because it's a job on the line. But if you have fun with it, this is my story. This is this is the kind of story I think Star Trek Voyager should be telling. So, in a sense, I pretend I'm the producer, and I'm telling them the kind of story I want them to be doing. That's just my way of doing it. But the answer is try to have fun with it. Hopefully, make it a good story in the first place, and hope that they'll respond to it.
I'm sure from your many, many years of doing conventions and interacting with fans, you probably get asked a lot, what's the best piece of advice for a young aspiring writer? So you've done that before, but I want to ask you a different way, I guess, to approach that is when writers approach you for things, what's the biggest hurdle that they have issues with that you've had to help them in some way overcome?
That I've had to help other writers overcome.
And not necessarily like a one-on-one kind of session, but just, if they come to you with a problem or an issue at writing scripts, what will be their problem getting things done or making things happen creatively?
No, when you're on staff at a show, you help the other writers who will drop in on each other and say, "Oh, I'm stuck over here. Can you give me any ideas?" You just talk it out. I mean, the answer, I guess, is talking things through, kicking ideas around, and without being too critical of, you got another person's feelings to take into consideration too. Just try to be helpful and talk things out. So basically, I talk to myself when I'm coming up with these pitches. Believe me, I spend weeks and weeks in prep for if I'm going into a given show. You want to come up with 6 stories. Well, you start with 20 and hone them down, So talking out loud to myself is part of the process. It's a quirk, but it's how I've always worked.
So, Paul, final question today. What is the best thing about being a part of the Star Trek universe?
Look, I got to, as I said earlier, I watched that first episode in 1966, and I got to be a part of that in various incarnations. And believe me, and it continues to pay off. I'll tell you, those shows never go out of reruns, and they pay off a little bit of money every 3 months. Not a whole lot of money, but it's a continuing reminder that, hey, I wrote this thing 25 years ago or whatever.
Well, you're definitely part of the Star Trek legacy, that's for sure. And you're also, of course, part of the Hercules and Xena legacy, too. And, we didn't talk a ton about them today, but if you guys want to hear more about not just the Star Trek stories we discussed today, but also Hercules, Xena, and plenty of other things that Paul has worked on, make sure you guys check out Swords, Starships, and Superheroes from Jacob Brown Press. And I'm really hoping one day, this book is going to be as valuable to someone else out there listening as that first time seeing those Harlan Ellison scripts were for you.
I'd like to think so. Thank you, Matthew.
So, Paul, thank you so much for your time today. Thanks for your information. I really do recommend anybody out there who wants to learn more about screenwriting for TV, film, whatever, definitely do take a look at Paul's book. We're going to have links to it in the show notes. Make sure you can pick up a copy for yourself. So, Paul, again, thank you so much. It's been wonderful. And I look forward to hopefully seeing you maybe getting your name one day on an episode of Star Trek Discovery or Strange New Worlds. It could happen, right?
Could happen. Sure. Thank you, Matthew.
All right, thank you so much. And that was our chat with Paul Robert Coyle. I really do wish I had a separate podcast all about Xena and Hercules just so I could pick his brain a little bit more about that. But I think that's going to be for a whole other day. And of course, don't forget to check out Paul's new memoirs from Jacobs Brown Press, titled Swords, Starships, and Superheroes, From Star Trek to Xena to Hercules. We're going to have links for that in the show notes, so make sure you check that out. Whispers was one of those Deep Space Nine episodes where O'Brien must suffer, and suffer he did. Inspired by the films The Parallax View and Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the majority of the production team and Cole Meany were very happy with the end result of this one. One of the fans of this in particular was David X. Cohen, co-creator and writer on Futurama, who would include plenty of Trek references in his animated series. Cole Meany said he played the part of the replicant O'Brien the same way he would play it if it was the real O'Brien, hoping to not give anything away in his actions, and really the only thing being odd was how everyone around him was behaving towards O'Brien. It's a really great episode, and if you haven't watched it in a while, I hope you do check it out again after listening to this podcast. I remember the first time that I watched it, and I wasn't quite sure where they were going to go, and now rewatching again for research as part of this episode, despite knowing the outcome, it was still pretty shocking because it was played so excellently by everyone in the show. So that wraps up this week's episode of Trek Untold. Thank you so much for checking it out this week. Please make sure that you're following us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, all at Trek Untold. That's one word, no spaces, at Trek Untold. It's the best way to get updates on guests, check out all the memes and other things that we're posting, and interact with myself and other Star Trek fans. If you'd like to support this podcast, go ahead and check out patreon.com/Trek Untold and become a subscriber to the show. or check out teespring.com/stores/Trek Untold to check out some of our merchandise. If you've been enjoying Trek Untold, please leave us a rating and review on iTunes or wherever you're listening to podcasts. And if you're on YouTube, please give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel, youtube.com/nerdnewstoday. Leaving ratings, reviews, and comments are things that all help this podcast grow, and they'll cost you nothing but a few seconds of your time. Doing things like that, or even telling your friends or other Star Trek fans about the stuff you've heard on the show and making sure they know about us, are huge helps to keeping Trek Untold growing. Thank you once again to our sponsor, Triple Fiction Productions. Go ahead and check them out at triple-fictionproductions.net. If you'd like to send us some feedback about this episode, suggest a guest, or ask to be booked on the show, go ahead and send me an email at trekuntold@gmail.com. And of course, thanks to listeners like you for choosing Trek Untold and making it your weekly Star Trek podcast. This has been Trek Untold. I'm Matthew Kaplowitz, and until next time, fortune favors the bold.
Trek Untold is sponsored by TrekSphere.com, promoting fan-produced Star Trek content in all forms, is powered by the Rageworks Podcasting Network, and is affiliated with Nerd News Today.